She'd been doing some work with Aboriginal historians on what were the walking trails, what were corroboree ground, what were meeting places. She put this over the top of the map of the CBD, and it's the same streets, it's the same parks. You really are walking in country every day.
Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson and I'm privileged today to be joined here by Kiersten Fishburn. I'll give her a moment to introduce herself in more detail. But before we go any further, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country. We're here in Sydney City, we're on Gadigal country. I want to take a moment to pay my deepest respects to our elders, both past and present. I want to recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that it was never ceded by treaty, and that wherever you're watching this content across Australia, across the many countries and nations today, I want to pay our deepest respects to those countries that you're on and consuming this content from as well. Impact Policy is a proud Aboriginal-owned First Nations business. We work closely with the public sector, work largely around engagement, communications, co-design, research and evaluation. And we partner with our clients to really try and achieve strong outcomes for our communities and projects they're leading as well. I might take a moment to hand to my friend Kiersten to tell us a little bit about herself, her background, and then we'll get into our yarn for today.
Thanks, Sam. So hi everyone, I'm Kiersten Fishburn and I'm the Secretary of the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure for the New South Wales Government. I'm really glad to be here with you today, Sam. I remember we had a beautiful yarn when you were still in the department, a long time ago now.
Feels like it.
And it was just a really great chat, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation and joining you here on Gadigal land. I live on Gadigal land, I was born on Gadigal land and working on Gadigal land, so it's a pretty special place for me.
That's it. Yeah, you spent a lot of time, living around sort of Redfern and adjacent communities.
Yeah, that's right. I lived in the Redfern block for, a decade. I think it was a decade. On Hugo Street, saw the community centre come out of the ground and the community change, but still always Aboriginal land. And my kids are up at Darlington School, or my son has been, and my daughter's there now, and really proud that we can send them to a school that respects and engages with Aboriginal culture so deeply. So it's a pretty special place for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It would have been quite an, part of your journey, and your trajectory personally and professionally, like spending so much time, for people that are listening, like the block was a very notorious place in Sydney City, very strong, resilient Aboriginal community, but, dealt with a combination of complex needs for a number of decades in different ways. I guess how did that insight personally help sort of shape your understanding or commitment or approach to how you sort of, in many ways champion Aboriginal outcomes today?
It's a really good question. So I moved into Hugo Street in the block when I was 19, and I don't think I knew very much about Aboriginal community or culture. I kind of went in pretty naively, but I did like the fact that there was a real community there, and people used to say, don't you think it's dangerous living here? And I was like, there's always someone on the street, right? You've got that passive surveillance. There's always someone around. I mean, a couple of times there's a couple of old blokes sitting in the park having a drink, but there's people around that you can talk to. I think it made me aware of the strength of community, but it would also, this is the 90s we're talking about, you really could see every day the challenges that community went through. And I was living there when the Redfern riots occurred, and that was a pretty scary moment, and the sense of anger in the community was really strong. It was the only time I thought, as a non-Aboriginal person, do I have a place here? Am I welcomed here? But interestingly, after that, I thought community rebuilt really quickly, and even living through that experience, I didn't feel unwelcome in the place. I felt, that, I was just part of the, you see the people in the pub, you see the aunties in the pub. I remember, that I never really was a big pokey player, but one day I went up to play the pokies and I won $300, and I was in the room with three aunties, and I was like, oh mate, I've got to buy these ladies some drink, or I'm not getting out of here, right? So went and shouted a round of drinks and sat and had a yarn with them as well. And there's still, the area's gentrified quite a bit, but there's still a really strong community, and I think that's a really special thing. And I love that my kids are growing up with culture in their school, and it's just normalised. It's just part of what they learn and how they understand, and that's I feel like a gift I've given them as a parent, because I grew up in the eastern suburbs. I didn't have any real exposure to culture at all till I moved into the inner city. So it's a really special place for me. I still just live around the corner, so it's I still see the same people I've seen. I see kids. I mean, I probably saw you, Sam, when you were a kid.
As you're naming those events, I'm thinking like
you're remembering it all. You were on Caroline Street.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so just diagonally across from me. So I bet I saw you as a kid. You were probably one of the rat bag kids,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. You would have seen my sister. She spent a lot of time there. Yeah, absolutely. It's and so when you think about, I guess the department here is doing some significant work around sort of Aboriginal outcomes and work in that sort of space. How much of your lived experience really has informed a lot of that sort of commitment to and priority for that sort of space here?
It's a really good question, and I think so. When I came back into the department, and we can go into my checkered history of being a secretary once and a secretary again. I always make the joke I'll be the same person to be sacked from the same job twice at some stage.
Exiled.
Exiled again. But one of the things I saw was that there was an enormous amount of goodwill and desire to do well and to achieve outcomes, but there wasn't a lot of structure around it. And some of it was more talk than action. And to go back to your question, if I reflect on what I saw living in the block and being in that community as well, is you actually needed tangible action. It all very well, talking up, culture or being, bringing goodwill and good energy to it, but you actually needed to do something as well. And I really wanted to make sure that the department was set up so we actually achieved outcomes. We didn't just virtue signal. And that was something really, really important to me, because we have, I think, more opportunity in my department than maybe anywhere else in government to get really strong economic and therefore social outcomes. So moving from, the Crown Lands estate, which is, in its name, it's a colonialist construct, right? Yeah. But how do we turn that into something that actually gives economic outcome? How do we do it in a way that isn't just handing over a parcel of land that doesn't have any value? How do we let people build houses or, run a business or lease out the land if that's what you want? It's not for me to determine. That's for Laucan community to determine. But how do we do that in a way that actually gets to an outcome rather than just being a transaction? That was really important to me. And I think that's because I saw firsthand that you actually need to give people economic empowerment and they need to be able to own it themselves. Like, you can't just have a welfare mentality when you're working with community. And I think it's very easy to fall into a welfare mentality, like helping out the black fellas, right?
Yeah,
that's completely and utterly against every form of how I conceive of reconciliation. We need to be in partnership and we need to be directed by community. But to do that, we need to have the right stuff structurally in the department so that we can respond.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's a real reflection of that impact of insight from lived experience, like you talk about even just like references to, connections with aunties and other community members that you still walk past and see today throughout the years, and the insight that I imagine you would have got into the resilience of a community dealing with so much complexity. That is an insight that can only probably ever be really understood by someone who has a level of lived experience and seeing that on the ground. And so I think hearing that sort of re-emerge in how you approach all of this sort of stuff, I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
I don't think, it doesn't mean that a leader can't have that impact without having a lived experience, but I think you can definitely see, how that insight is informed, by that journey massively. It sort of makes me think about, you talk about the gentrification or the shift in the block, and, we see the community look very different to what it was like when, you were 19 or, my sister was there with my dad, but, I guess priorities for the department, housing is massive. Housing.
That's the three words. And
right? I think you said it at the PIA conference. If you say it backwards, it sounds the same.
It sounds the same, and the priorities are the same, right? Yeah. We are at the moment in New South Wales, and I think across Australia, but it's particularly acute in New South Wales, in a genuine housing crisis. That has knock-on impacts into every part of someone's life. And I do think being in the block, Aboriginal housing was something that was, it's really significant, right? Can you be near family? Can you be near community? Do you have security of tenure? Because if you don't have security of tenure and you're moving around all the time, it's hard to get a job. You might have to move the school your kids are in. Like, all of these things flow down from being able to have a house, whether you own it or rent it. But if you rent it, knowing that you can stay in it and you can live your life in it, all of those things are absolutely critical, and they're critical for everyone.
Absolutely.
But for Aboriginal community, I think as well, it becomes even more critical because you've got a whole lot of structural barriers in place. And if you don't have a house, right, that is absolutely a fundamental thing. If you don't have a house, how are you going to be able to tackle any of the other structural issues as well? Like the barriers just become absolutely acute. And fascinating, I was reflecting, thinking I was going to talk to you, Sam, and I was remembering in my 30s, I did this I had an amazing experience. I did the Vincent Fairfax Fellowship into Ethical Leadership, right? And it taught you how to think to be a leader, but to be an ethical leader, to ask yourself ethical questions. And one of the things you did in that course was you spent a week out in mining communities where, of course, the ethical conundrums around mining are really acute. And I was out in Newman in WA, and one of the things which is a BHP town, right? And one of the things that we were looking at there was the social impacts of the mine and how it impacted on the community. And I remember going and speaking to the council, and they were complaining that they give houses to the Aboriginal community in town to try and encourage them to work, and people would knock walls down, and the council would be incredibly frustrated about this. But it's actually because people wanted to live with their families the way they wanted to live, right?
Yeah,
and they'd much rather have the bigger room, and that's that was part of how you set your family structure up.
Totally.
And to me, it was blindingly apparent why a council not just speaking to community and building the houses that community want to live in, right?
Yeah,
they were
absolutely.
building these houses to a kind of cookie cutter model that probably suited a nuclear family, and mob didn't want to live like that.
Yeah,
and
totally.
it seemed such a blatantly obvious solution, and I couldn't understand why the council couldn't just think themselves through this. And I was thinking about that when we talk about, and I talk about handing back land for Aboriginal housing. Well, that allows community to build housing the way they want it to be built. And for some people, that might be your perfect nuclear family. But for other families, they might want extended family in there.
Absolutely.
And we don't tend to build like that or think like that. So that self-determination and that empowerment is absolutely critical, or else you're just making the same mistakes over and over again. Yeah,
absolutely. I've got friends living in social housing that have turned their carports into extra rooms. Because they've got so much family
extended
that stay in
family
there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just being able to try and get people to flip that model a bit. I think is really crucial. But it'll be slow to move some areas of government or some ways of thinking. But if you're working with a LAUC and they're able to, build and develop themselves, then you can do it much more rapidly. So I'm really determined to see how we can accelerate that and actually allow people to do what they want to do. And that means we're looking at the planning laws, looking at, the way we work maybe with the building commissioner, all those things I think have to be on the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing, and the block redevelopment and journey there was, not a linear journey in terms of
it was
how
very
it got
contested,
wasn't it?
Very
contested, absolutely. There was a 10 embassy down there and completely acknowledged that journey there as well. But I think one thing that I love seeing now, and I have friends down there that live on the block with their families, is it really is the recreation of a like a really strong social community for families. I just, so many families live down there door to door with each other. And there's this beautiful little community that's growing up where I'm watching my son's friends, just every day playing out on the street, playing in the park, like it was when we were growing up, that you don't sort of see anymore. And we talk about this whole, way we interact socially is so disconnected, and how do we design public spaces and environments so that we can have more time to be connected and be outside. And I look down there and that's all I see.
Yes.
I see kids tearing up and down the street on their bikes, wrestling around, playing soccer and footy in the park. Like, it reminds me of what it was like as a kid.
Yep.
And I know it's a bit of a, maybe it's more of, I don't know how this sits into the social housing, but like, because I'm a proud product of public housing. And I have family that still live in the public housing space at the moment. And I think one of the challenges that I sort of see is how we sort of deal with I've got family members that live on a street where they're the only family, and they've got a whole block of families that have, it's a new generation now, they're like a series of elderly tenants that are now the only occupants in houses. And they've been there for their whole life, right? Like, they don't want to leave, and rightly so. Completely get that, completely understand that. But I think what I sort of see with the block comparison is that's what it reminded me of when I grew up in Glebe. That's what it was. Every street was full of families, and every kid was on that's where our closest social bonds and connections were made. And then I sort of see what's at the experience in Maroubra. And there's this stark contrast between a family and then a series of sort of aging tenants, and how do we sort of start to think about some of those complexities? Is it something that we, I feel like it's such a sensitive topic to talk about because you're talking about people's access and livelihood and right. But then when we're talking about crisis and, priority housing waiting lists that are thousands, and stuff like that. I just look at the block example. I just think is there a way we can start to think about how we, not just within Aboriginal communities, but how we start to design policy that better supports the creation of, supporting growing and working families to stay connected and to grow together well.
I think you pick up on some of the things that I feel really passionate about communities, and I talk really openly about the fact that I'm a big supporter of density. And I'm a big supporter of density because it's better for the environment to begin with. And, we all have a absolute moral and ethical responsibility to do what we can for the environment. But I also think density is really good for social reasons, for the things you pick up, right? Like, you and I know those terraces in the block, right? They're 3 metres wide, 4 metres wide at most, right? They're little houses. Yeah. But you've got that critical mass of families and people multi-generational that allows for building up that community. Now, that's not something that's exclusive to Aboriginal community, right? You see that in a whole lot of communities. Like, we live in a tiny little terrace as well. Every afternoon at school, the park up the road, it's a sea of kids in the red T-shirts from Darlington Public playing together because that's their public open space, right? We don't have back gardens where we are, but it actually means kids come together, and you've got from K to 6 all playing together in the playground, getting to know each other. Yeah. So I think there's some real positive benefits of density that, as long as you make sure you do have those public open spaces and areas where families and kids can get out and about, or, it's a cross-generational in the local park, then you actually end up with all of those great community outcomes, and you end up with kids being able to get out and about on the streets because there's always people around, right? They walk to school because there's people around, it's all of those great things. So, people, there's always that density debate, right? But density done well actually leads to those really great social outcomes. So I'm really passionate supporter of that for communities and families. I think it's a really positive thing.
Absolutely. And you think about the role of local government, and we think about public spaces and even, how we navigate the housing crisis. And it's not all on state government, right? How local government has a massive role that they play. And one of the things that I picked up about, doing some research in prep for our yarn today was around the representation of the diversity of representation in terms of local councillors. And you made a great point in a panel that you were sitting on around the if we really want to drive change for building impact for future generations, we need to work towards more diversity in terms of representation. I think you quoted, I can't remember the stats, but maybe 80% of councillors over the age of 60.
Oh no, it's high. It's not quite 80, but it's pretty high. Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. and you talked about the need for representation and stuff. But you made a really great point about how when you're at Liverpool Council and you have the youth parliament.
Yep.
And those kids talked about the playgrounds being boring.
Yes.
They were like, once we turn 8 or 9 years old, we don't
the
want to
playground's
play
really
them anymore.
boring. Yeah, it's designed for 4-year-olds,
Yeah.
but they still want to be out and playing.
Yeah.
So we had this amazing. I'm glad you remembered that because I was really proud of that. We had a youth parliament that was years 5 and 6 came into the council chambers and they gave presentations on things that mattered to them, and we were there to listen and respond. And that was one of the first things they said. Oh yeah, the playgrounds are really boring. Yeah. So then when we built a new playground down at Casula, it's got it's 3 stories in the sky. This slide, and it terrifies the hell out of me. The kids love it, right? So we actually listened to what they did and then went and designed to make something that responded to what they needed. I wish every council had something like that. I think that's a really good way of hearing youth voice. And I agree with you. Like, what does worry me sometimes is that we've got local councils, and I'm ex-local government. I'm a passionate supporter of local government, but generally the councillors are not representative of their community. And so how do you actually hear a youth voice? How do you hear the voice of someone who's Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? How do you hear multicultural community? The representation is not fantastic. We still don't have gender parity of councillors. It's sneaking up, but it's still not great. So all of those things do concern me a bit, because councils are making really significant decisions for their communities, but they're kind of making decisions for the community that exists there today, whereas of course the decisions they make may have hundreds of years impact. Absolutely. And they're not thinking about the community of the future because they're not as representative. So that's a big issue, I think, for local government, and it's one that we talk about in Office of Local Government, trying to encourage greater representation. We do have pretty good representation by percentage of Aboriginal councillors, but it's really far out west. We're not seeing it in the metro area yet. So even though if you looked at the stats, you'd say, oh, hang on, that's parity. Okay. It's really heavily weighted once you get over the, kind of get out to the central west and beyond. We're not seeing it in metro as much as I think we should be seeing it.
Yeah, interesting. It's always, I love the example because we do a lot of, we do a lot of work in engagement and consultation, and particularly around youth and young people. And having a background in the sort of youth sector for a long time early in my career, it's so often an underrepresented voice in the development of good policy. And there's so much of and not just for young people, many different groups where policy or projects impact them, consultation can sometimes not be as effective. And I just think that example is just one that really stuck out, because it's like when we're designing something together that's going to directly impact, or the use of it is for a specific service group, that should be the loudest voice in the room, right? Yes. And so I just thought examples like that are really critical for how we start to think about how we can elevate those voices. Yes. Maybe we're not going to have a formal youth council rep, but how can we formalize structures and processes within systems that really elevate a bit of voice and a bit of power around that sort of stuff? And I think whether it's a youth parliament or whether it's different ways we think about it, I think this is not just specific for Aboriginal communities, for all young people, how we can do that work better. There's an amazing park that's being redesigned in Woolloomooloo where we're at, and it's like I have fun playing there. So I know that's been informed by,
you're too young.
That's it, young at heart, and stuff like that as well. So, we were together at the PIA conference last week. So we've got a really strong relationship with PIA. They've got an Aboriginal knowledge circle that informs a lot of the work they're really trying to drive in the planning sector. You'd probably remember from the conference program that there's, elements of country and Aboriginal culture is really weaved throughout that whole program.
Absolutely.
And really intentionally. And I really have to acknowledge Matt Collins and the team there for the work that they do. But you were there last week. Is there any sort of, for people that might be listening or watching this that didn't have the capacity or access to get to there, is there any sort of key points that you might want to share from your keynote that you think people might be able to take away? Or
oh, look, now you're making me reflect back on what I said, right? I'm sure I talked about housing quite a bit as well. from my perspective in the planning space, that caring for country and the framework that the department has, but also that PIA has contributed to and a community have contributed to as well, is really critical. I always reflect on, and this is fairly early in my career, when I was at City of Sydney, I had the city historian was in my business area, and she did this thing where she got out, the maps, this planning world, right? You've always got to have a map.
Yeah.
And it was a map of the Sydney CBD, and then she overlaid it, bit of butter paper, with she'd been doing some work with Aboriginal historians on what were the walking trails, what were corroboree ground, what were meeting places. And she put this over the top of the map of the CBD, and it's the same streets, it's the same parks, it's the same spaces. And it was like a lightning bolt to me that the first time I'd ever actually realised you really are walking in country every day, right? In Australia, right? You're walking the same paths that have been trod for 80,000 years. You're sitting in Hyde Park and people would have met there, 50,000 years ago, George Street, Oxford Street. And you can see them, right? When you think about it, like they're up and down ridgeways, so you can see elevated. And I mean, I must have known this, right? You think you must know this, but it was like an absolute bolt from the blue. And it is, every time I talk to, young planners or something, I bring up that story and I remind them, just look out at your streets, look at your parks. When we were out in Parramatta, look at the Barramatagal, right? Like people have been, you see a ferry go up it. Well, people have been travelling up and down that waterway from time immemorial, right? Kids have been swimming in it, people have been fishing in it. And it was just such a beautiful and special thing to be able to think about and talk to planners about, that we have this gift in planning of raising country up. Right, like creating, caring for country by respecting the fact that it's built into us everywhere. If you just open your eyes and you just look at it and think about it. I don't think I talked about that at the PIA conference, but I was reflecting on that when we think about how do we do caring for country.
Absolutely.
We've got such a gift to be able to just elevate it and bring it up and respect it. But even just as we're walking it, just think about it, right?
Yeah.
Like, what did somebody do in this space, right? This is still, we talk about in the block where kids are playing. I mean, there would have been kids playing in those spaces for thousands of years past. And I don't know, I feel embarrassed that I'm telling you a story that it took me till I was, 30 to really figure this stuff out. But it once you get it, right? And then you feel I have an absolute. It's not just a responsibility, it's a gift, right? Because you can bring together this continuous history, you can bring it to life and share it in a way that makes everyone's life so much richer. Like, it's just a beautiful thing planning gets to do.
Absolutely. And I think like one of the key parts of that sort of story for me is that much of what you learnt was really like remembering.
Yeah.
It wasn't that sometimes planning is not always about recreating something new.
Yes.
Sometimes it's about remembering what.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I love, because people can say that, I think sometimes when you think about caring for country, people go to memorialising, but actually this is lived, right? Like this is still spaces we walk in and we always will, right? So it's that recognising that culture is alive now. It's not just something that you recognise from the past. And when we've got some beautiful training, our Wingargli training course that you did some of the work for, Sam. Yeah. And
the boys here shot the content,
video content. Well, I love it. I mean, I'm not ashamed to tell you I cried 3 times during that training. But one of the bits I love, there was someone talking about how dream time is now time as well. And it again, those things when you stop and think about it, okay, how do we translate that into a planning space? Absolutely. Like this is continuous time. That just was really rich experience to be able to sit and think that through. So, all of these things you learn through listening, through observing, through yarning, right? Like they all make your work deeper and more meaningful. And I hope that as the department, we can really show that and embed that as well. That's something I really want us to own, because there's so much opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I tell you what absolutely made me bawl my eyes out, if either of you guys filmed it, the one where the women went to go and do the cultural burning. And it was an all woman crew, because it was women's spaces that they were doing the burn for. And they were providing the education and the learning, and they were pumped after they'd done it. They were so proud. And I watched that video and I just cried and cried. You know, when you watch something where people are proud of what they've done and achieved, and it hits you emotionally.
Absolutely.
I came out of my office like, oh my God, you got there. Like, are you okay? I'm like, no, you got to watch this. It's so moving. Yeah, it's terrific. That's something as well, you know, as a woman leader as well. And, you know, I really get excited when I see women empowered and engaged. And I think, particularly in something that like cultural burning, right? I think a lot of people's minds, that's men's work, right? But it's also women's work and has always been women's work. So that was really, I just found that incredibly moving and powerful.
Yeah, beautiful.
I'm going to get teary thinking about it. Yeah.
I think you talk about like the real power of like that's communications and storytelling, right?
Yeah.
And so often in, like you're talking about like cultural capability and training resources, and you know, that, but also like policy and project stuff, communications and storytelling is so powerful to be able to really achieve outcomes and communicate that sort of stuff internally, but for our communities as well. I feel like that's something that we really try and champion in terms of really driving home how critical that sort of stuff is. And even just hearing you talk about, you know, the visceral impact of that sort of training, like that's the stuff you take away. It's the connection. Yeah. It's the connection to the content. Yeah. How does this make me feel? What am I taking from this that's going to inform how I think about something in the future or how I engage with something? It's not like, you know, here's 6 rules to engaging with cultural learning, you know? So I think you just really like illustrate how powerful storytelling is, as well as a part of capability development as well.
And look, I think people connect to a story in a way that they're never going to connect to a bland piece of policy. Yeah. And being able to make that opportunity to sit down and have a yarn, right? Like that's the hardest thing in leadership sometimes, right? Your time is very constrained. I'm sure people always think, you know, when you get to the top of the pile, you know, wow, you get to do whatever you want. On the contrary, I think my time is less my own. I have less autonomy than probably anyone in the department, because I'm always at the, you know, call of my ministers, or a crisis will happen or something. But what I've learnt more and more in my career is if you can carve out some time to talk to people, to listen to people, to have that yarning experience, you will be a better leader as a consequence of it, and you will make better decisions as well. It's always hard, but I've never regretted taking the opportunity to be able to talk to people and find out about them. And that makes a huge difference in the way you can connect to people, and your understanding of people's lives and experiences becomes richer then as well. And it can be very easy in leadership to just sit at the top of the pile and forget that you're actually leading people. And I really, really value the time when I get to go and talk to staff. And they're always a bit shy at first, to be honest, which is weird, because I think I'm the least intimidating person in the world. But that when I do get the chance to do that, that's what makes the job worthwhile as well, and makes me, I hope, better at leadership, because I don't forget that I'm leading people. That's ultimately my job, is to lead people.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's connections and relationships, and leading with them are critical.
Yeah, they make a huge difference. Yeah. And not having relationships and that are transactional, right? Like I get asked all the time, oh, how important is networking? Well, you know, it's great to know people, and I know everyone, right? Like I'm one of those people, but I don't go into any of those relationships or situations just transactionally, because I think that's disrespectful apart from anything else.
Absolutely.
Like I go in because I actually really like people. I'm really curious. I like to hear people's stories. and I don't expect anything out of it. And I think that's made a huge difference, that, you know, people know that they can trust me and that I'll go in and, you know, I want to give as much as I want to take. You know, sometimes you want something, but hopefully you've built that relationship in the first instance. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think when you talk about that sort of approach to leadership and ways of working, it sort of really reminds me as well of the Connecting with Country framework in terms of the stages that they talk about. And it uses the language around, and I'm going to paraphrase Richard Parsons, who had it on a podcast a while ago, who's ex-DPE at the time. And he was talking to me about the Connecting with Country framework, and he was like, the stages of shifting from sensing to imagining to shaping and caring. And he's like, you can almost map them parallel to how we traditionally approach project management, you know, which is like the business case, the scoping, the assessment, and the management. And he's like, it was such and when he said that, I was just like, it was like a light bulb moment as well, similar to like the mapping sort of experience he had with City of Sydney. But again, just that coming back to how we approach our ways of working, how we remember, how we prioritise connection and relationships to do work well. And then when you just made that point around leadership and shifting from transactional engagement to relational engagement, it was just like, I feel like that's really just the crux, like that's the anchor for how we really build strong relationships and engagement with Aboriginal communities, all communities, into the future. And that's a constant constant flag we're flying when we're doing our work. And we often get engaged to provide advice and guidance and do that sort of stuff. But how do we support organisations to shift from transactional sort of project to project based connection and relationship and transaction to embedded, connected long-term relationships with communities? And so I sort of say that to segue into, it's the Koori Knockout Week.
Yes.
And
we're sponsoring.
Yes. Yep. And it's not the first time either.
No.
I think it's maybe the third.
Yep.
Maybe. And sort of, you know, how critical it is to have a presence at significant events like this. And for anyone who's listening that's not familiar with the Koori Knockout, it's the largest gathering of Aboriginal people in the Southern Hemisphere. It's ran for 52, 53
it's been going
years.
A long time.
And it's completely community controlled and led, which is, you know, really just reinforces the fact that our people, you know, can really drive and deliver solutions and outcomes when they're self-determining the agendas. But how important is it for, you know, DFI to be a part of this? What's that relationship look like? Why is it important for the agency?
So two reasons, I think. And the first is a kind of pragmatic one. So in my department, we've got Crown Lands and Planning, and both of them arguably don't work very well with community, right? Crown Lands is literally, we've taken the land, right? And Planning carves up land in a way that is inconsistent with Aboriginal cultural practice or belief, right? So these two things are things where they're, you know, it is a underlying tension between these parts of the New South Wales government and Aboriginal community. And one of the things that I want to try and do is make this a place where Aboriginal people want to work and contribute and engage, because this is a system that we work within, and if we don't have Aboriginal people engaged in it as practitioners, like in the department itself, we're not going to get great outcomes, to be honest, for community or for the business itself. So it's a really pragmatic thing. I want to demonstrate that the department is a place where it's great to work, where there is a, you know, Aboriginal cohort where you can, you know, we've got 3-4 Aboriginal executive directors, you know, like, so you can make a career here, and it is a place that it is great to work in. So it's a very pragmatic reason. I think the other one as well, though, is Knockout's just a lot of fun, right? You know,
absolutely.
And it's great to be associated with that and to be able to have my staff there. We'll have about 20 staff over the weekend. Engaging and listening to community. As you say, it's one of the biggest gatherings. this is all intel gathering for people,
absolutely.
right? Hear what's going on the ground.
Absolutely.
Again, get in and have a yarn. And so they're probably the two reasons. And I'm not ashamed of making pragmatic decisions. I think it's good for the department and good for the knockout that we're involved as well. So that's been really exciting. I remember knockout. So when I was at City of Sydney, I did all the sponsorships for the city as part of my job. We used to sponsor knockout then. It was down at Redfern Oval for quite a few years. So I've had a long association with it now. I think about it.
Yeah, wow. It's something that I always tried to really drive in the public sector, the importance of agencies, departments, teams having a real sort of strategy when they think about community engagement and they think about significant events, but particularly the knockout.
Yep.
Because we think about how much community consultation that we do across the state, particularly with our
people.
We
over-consult because we just don't quite land it right.
Yeah. And I think the Koori Knockout really presents an opportunity for departments, teams, businesses to actually think about like what are the really critical things that we need to understand and hear from our people.
Yep.
Or in the lead up to a knockout, certain communities or regional towns or urban communities, how can we maybe partner with those teams locally? Because really it becomes a representative of the community in the lead up to the event.
Yeah.
And how do we maybe partner and sponsor that team locally and then use that as an opportunity to really strengthen the relationship as well. And then through that, strengthen the opportunity to really deep and meaningful engagement. And I think that's where the next stage of, relationship with the knockout looks like for the public sector is actually thinking about exactly what we started this yarn about. How do we shift it to really sort of deep and meaningful relationships with community? Because that's one of the complexities is you never know which community is hosting it each year,
that's
right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of at a significant level, it is transactional because it's whoever wins it is going to be the partner.
Be the host.
But then I think what we have a real opportunity to look at is how we think about sponsoring the knockout at a local level as well.
Yeah, that's a lovely idea. Okay, I'll take that one and think about it. I think as well, it's been interesting for me too. So when I go out into the regions, I always try and meet with the louts because I think it's respectful to go and meet with the person whose country you're on. And I went and met with a particular group. I won't name them because I haven't asked for permission. But when I was speaking to the CEO and the chair, they were like, "Oh, well, what do you want from us?" And I was like, "Oh no, I'm just here to have a conversation and hear what you want to tell me." Yeah. They were like, "Oh," and I thought, "Oh my goodness, are we just going into these meetings making a demand rather than going in and just having a conversation?" And for me, it was like, well, if I get to know these people, there'll be points where there'll be tension points with the department. But if I've made the effort to say hello when I'm out and about, that's going to help, right? Like that's the relationship. And I genuinely want to know what are your top 3 issues every time I go out into the meeting. And I really got quite a shock that and clearly they were asking me this question because that's been their experience.
Definitely.
Someone from the government will turn up and say, "Here's the things I want from you."
Yeah.
So that was it's. Funny saying now we're saying it's like I'm layering learning upon learning. When you get out and do it, right, you get these moments and you go, hang on, all right, well, I'm going to have to shift how I think about this or do this as a consequence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's we do a lot of work in co-design, and a big part of co-design before you even start designing together is relationships.
Yes.
It's being in the grey. It's navigating, the space that we're in before we even start to build something together. I think that's the real reality of what it's like, what government and community's relationship has been like for so long as it's been so transactional. And I think exactly right. Like we tell people, and it's hard because there's a breadth and depth to how you can do co-design based on timelines and resources and priorities. Like we get that. But when you have the capacity, like you just said, to be able to have space to connect with people, to hear them, and to come back and share time and build connection, relationship before you even start to dive deep into that sort of stuff.
Yes.
It's hard because it's an investment of time initially that people might feel like they're so used to having to try and push forward that they feel like they're not being productive. But the reality is if you zoom out a bit, what you get is really significant impact further down the track. And that's what we're constantly trying to provide advice and guidance around when we're working on projects like that, is exactly the approach that you talk about taking. Sitting with people and listening, like, so what do you want to have? And our biggest advice to public servants is when you walk in as a government representative, you might be walking in as a planner and someone might have a problem with water.
Yep.
And you're going to get probably fucking lifted about the water problem.
Yeah.
And you just need to listen and not take that personally, and just like, our people want to be heard, and you hear them and then you provide as much advice and guidance as you can, but you don't need to take that defensively or feel personally attacked. Just understand that we represent a system, and it happens to us as blackfellas as well. We're not immune to walking into communities and not
you're
getting
expected to be the expert on anything to do with Aboriginal culture.
Anything with a waratah, you've got to be accountable for, you know, and whether you're black or white, that's often an experience. And so exactly what you said, like, just not feeling like you have to be driving your agenda so hard in engagement is so important for that, you know, meaningful connection.
Do you know what as well? I think having come from local government gives me a bit more of that understanding, because when you're in local government, it's very, the state government is quite opaque. It can be hard to get into. So if you get one senior bureaucrat in the room, you're going to give them everything, right? They might be the planner, but you're going to tell them about your transport issue and your school that's lacking, because this is your one opportunity, right? So I think I'm a bit more, relaxed about just being the broader representative as a consequence, because I can flip it back to when I was a council general manager, and it's like, nah, I've got them, and they're going to get every single problem I've got with the state in one hit. So I can absolutely see where people come from that perspective.
Definitely. But often in those spaces, right, people just want to be heard.
Yeah.
Like, they're not expecting you to solve. You can't solve a problem right there and then.
Yeah.
But if the outcome is relationships, and how you progress to the next stage, then really it just comes back to how do you hold space for someone and hear them with respect and dignity. And if someone's passionate, doesn't always mean they're angry.
No.
You know, and I think that's something we're constantly navigating as well. I think when I did some work with Bowraville many years ago, and the guys here on the crew were here as part of that work, we had like a combination of secretaries in the town hall, and we hosted a Bowraville town hall meeting, and basically just did it was easily over 100 people. I've never been part of a community engagement experience like this, but the whole town turned up. And what we did is we created a series of like speed dating sections, and we just sat a secretary at each speed dating section. The secretary rolled up their sleeves with a pen, a marker, and we just speed dated around, and that secretary listened, and people just blasted, there's not enough of this, not enough of that, this, and I said, but the power of like giving a secretary a pen and saying you can scribe for this. The actual power for that in terms of like people feeling like I'm being heard, and this is really like, it really shifts that power relationship, and it really makes for a really meaningful connection. And we were able to do some great work because of that, But I think it's I think it's like my message for.
Remember that speed one. I like that.
I think it's people. I did it in facilitated a workshop with the secretary for DCJ last year, and it was a breakout session around the forced child removal space, and I had him and I had a DepSec and an ED in the room, and I said to the staff, I said, I'm gonna make them the scribes, and I'm going to do this hot desk exercise. And they were like, you're going to make the secretary and the DepSec scribe? And I said, because that's like that, like, trust me. And the outcome from that session was amazing.
Yes.
Because of exactly what we've yarned about. Yeah. And I said, and I walked up, I said, are you right? And he said, yeah, no worries. So I think that, like you said, when you talked about the student planners being a bit nervous at the front, like, I think, when you're working with leadership, often like, just have that conversation. Like, we're all people and professionals, and we're all trying to get the same outcome together too, right? As well. So if you ever need some speed dating advice,
I'm on it.
Shoot some stuff. I'm conscious of time, and this time's flown by. And I've really. This
is like when we first sat down and had it was just like just talking.
Really good. And I guess I don't want to cut off because I know you've got to jump off at 10:30. So maybe just coming back, I feel like we've touched on so much stuff that's really valuable for people listening that are, professionals here at DeFi, whether they're community stakeholders, whether they're working across government and in community too. Is there any sort of key messages around what the future looks like for DeFi in terms of Aboriginal outcomes, in terms of what people could take away? Any sort of final messages?
Any final messages? So look, it is an evolving space is probably my message. Like we certainly don't feel we've got everything right. There's a few pieces of work that are really important to me and to the department, and I should say this is really elevated at our executive leadership team too. This is something we talk about, we do workshops on, we're really committed to, so we're all in. I talked about that, you return land or you do an ILIA for native title or whatever it is. How do we translate that then? If I give a parcel of land, we return a parcel of land to allow. How do we translate that through the planning system so that they can put housing on it or whatever they wish to do with it? How do we make that pathway really seamless? How do we make sure that we provide access to advice? Because, a lot of these, communities are, small, they might not have access to a planner. How do we make sure we provide that? And then the final piece of the puzzle is, how do we help with, the relationships or the financing or the engagement so that we're really creating a seamless journey for Aboriginal community? Doing that not just in the, transactional stuff around land, but how do we do that in the way we engage? How do we make it seamless? How we consult? How do we bring voice in early rather than at the end? Because that's always the challenge with consultation, isn't it? All of these things we're really actively working on at the moment and remaining absolutely committed to the work that we do in land claims and native title, but translating that into through the Roads to Home program, translating that for our Aboriginal planning concierge. We've got all the pieces there. We just need to make it a more seamless journey and make it one where we're a trusted partner, and that's where we want to move ourselves to over time. It's very exciting. Absolutely. It is, you think about what do you want to leave as a leader, and if I can gear the department up, and it's certainly not me alone, it is the executive team, it's Danny Lester and his team, it's the many people we have in the department who are passionate about this work. If our legacy is getting this right, that'll be something that I'll feel very, very proud of.
Absolutely, and I think it'll be, like you touched on at the very start, when you talked about the start of your journey and your lived experience and your connection to our communities, is about really shifting the approach to this sort of space in terms of the economic empowerment and opportunities. That is critical, right? That is
absolutely at the core. I mean, there's so many things that we need to do for reconciliation, and being respectful and listening and learning and representing are all crucial things, and we've touched on all of those. But at its heart, unless you have economic independence and economic empowerment, all of those other things just become nice, right? They don't become rich and real. If community are not able to determine what they wish to do themselves, and if they do not have the economic independence to do it, then we have failed. I really firmly believe that. And it's not for me or anyone really in government to determine what that looks like. We need to co-design that, we need to build that together. But at its heart, people need to be able to have somewhere to live and money behind them and opportunity aligned to that as well. And that's as individuals, but community too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, a powerful yarn.
I could talk to you for all day. Yeah.
And hopefully we get you on again in the future sometime.
Thank you. Well, hold me to account, Sam. That's the critical thing, right? Like, we need to be open to being challenged as well. So happy to come back on again and you tell me how we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kiersten.